Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue à cette troisième conférence, la dernière donc, du cycle de conférences de l'OVPR de cet automne 2016, un cycle de conférences qui porte sur la question des acteurs politiques et des territoires, un cycle de conférences que nous avons organisé avec Oscar Mazzoleni en lien avec un projet du Fonds national que nous venons de démarrer en octobre, donc ça fait il y a 2 mois, un projet Fonds national qui porte, comme vous voyez, sur l'étude des changements urbains affectant les villes suisses et le changement, les transformations du profil des élus locaux de ces mêmes villes suisses. L'équipe de recherche est composée par Oscar Mazzoleni, moi-même et André Mac. Sur le projet sont engagés 2 doctorants, Roberto Di Capua et Karim Lassed. Et l'objectif principal de ce projet est notamment de se pencher et de s'intéresser à l'analyse du profil des élus locaux de 4 villes suisses, à savoir Lausanne, Lucerne, Lugano et Zurich, pour une longue période qui va de 1946 à nos jours, à 2016, et en même temps donc, étudier ce profil des élus locaux en lien avec les changements socio-économiques qui touchent ces 4 villes suisses. Donc les questions de recherche principales que vous voyez donc, affichées sont donc, notamment dans quelle mesure les changements sociaux, urbains, institutionnels et politiques affectent le profil des élus locaux. Et deuxième question, c'est de quelle manière, par rapport donc, à ce profil des élus locaux, on constate un processus de démocratisation dans le recrutement de ces élus et l'émergence d'une dimension de professionnalisation. Nous avons le plaisir ce soir d'accueillir Linda Basile qui vient donc nous présenter quelques éléments tirés de sa thèse de doctorat qu'elle a défendue à l'Université de Sienne en 2014. Linda Basile est chercheuse postdoctorat au Center for the Study of Political Change de l'Université de Sienne. Elle est active, quand même, elle est engagée sur plusieurs domaines de recherche qui vont des partis politiques à l'étude des politiques territoriales encore à l'étude de l'opinion publique et des élites. Elle a déjà quand même pu publier quelques papiers liés aussi à ces recherches. Et en ce moment, elle est directement impliquée, elle a été comme responsable de la mise sur pied du projet You Engage dans le cadre du programme Horizon 2020 de l'Union européenne, un projet donc, qui s'intéresse à étudier un petit peu les rapports entre la population des États de l'Union européenne et le rapport avec les élites supranationales et les élites nationales. Donc c'est donc avec plaisir que, comme j'ai dit, on a invité Linda. Le discutant de ce soir, et je remercie vivement aussi d'être là, c'est Sean Muller, docteur donc, et chercheur d'un projet Ambizione du Fonds national, chercheur à l'Université de Berne, qui donc discutera l'intervention de Linda qui va durer pour une 40aine de minutes. Merci Linda.
I switch to English now. Sorry. Okay, so first of all, thank you for having invited me to give this presentation. I'm very glad because, as Andrea anticipated, I'm active on several fields of research, but this is my first field of research where I started from. So the territorial dimension, the study of political parties' attitudes towards what we can call, for the Italian case in particular, the process of decentralization. So basically, my presentation will start from what I developed in my research for my PhD dissertation. But then, after that dissertation, I kept on working on this research, and I wrote 2 papers, and I developed further research, which has improved my findings, my methodology, and so on. So now I'm in the stage to reorganize all my findings and all my ideas into a full-fledged book. And that's why I want to share with you how I am collecting and reorganizing my ideas, and I'm really looking forward to receiving your feedback. So the outline of my presentation today is to start from my basic ideas, so from my research question, the perspective that I will adopt in my research, and the specific tool that I'm going to use to address my research question. Then, as far as my research will have as target not just the Italian readers, but also a broader reader, I want to provide some timelines of the event of the territorial reforms in Italy, because sometimes it's not so straightforward to understand what happened in the troubled process of decentralization in my country. And then I will show you a few findings. These are the very first and preliminary insights indeed about my agenda setting perspective. I will tell you in a while what I mean for agenda setting, and in particular what is my main research goal: to start from some assumptions and to come up to a reformulation of these assumptions thanks to my research. So let's start from the third part, rethinking bounty attitude. So why I talk about rethinking? My idea, my starting idea is to observe that Italy has moved over the years from a unitary state to a decentralized system. Sometimes there has been some debate about whether Italy is going towards federalist system. I feel really, I would be really careful in talking about a federalized system, talking about Italy, especially when talking in Switzerland, because a federal system is something that stems from independent, autonomous states who would decide to stay together into a federalized union. And this is, for example, the case of the European Union. We can talk of a process of federalization when talking about the European Union, but I don't think that it is the case of Italy, where it has been mostly a top-down process. So the central state that has decided to transfer power and competencies towards the subnational level. So it became from a unitary state, a strongly unitary state, towards a decentralized system. As a political scientist, we might be interested in two aspects of this process. The first one is the outcome. So, how much decentralized is Italy now? How are these policy reforms? Have been they effective or not? For example, we have this seminal book by Putnam about how differentiated is the effect and the effectiveness of regions in Italy. But I was not interested in the outcome side. I was interested in the step before. That is the dynamics, and more in particular the actors that have realized these dynamics that then have brought it to the policy change. So I was mostly interested in what happened behind the scenes of the territorial reforms. So I was interested when I wrote, for example, in my thesis, in the backstage of politics. Sometimes it is a very hard side, the backstage of politics, but I was interested in that. Of course, Italy, as a Western democratic system, parliamentary system, should consider as main actors the political parties, because political parties are the actors that in a parliamentary system are always behind and underlying the decisions over policy reforms. So my idea, and this is for example an idea that we can take in all the literature on party positioning. If we take for example Benoit and Laver, they also argue that the agenda and the programmatic platform of political parties affect the electoral and the legislative dynamics. To know what parties think make us able to understand what will parties do when they will be in parliament. This is an example of what I mean. If we take the vote at the Senate, I just took one of the two chambers because we still have two chambers in Italy, but this is the vote of the Senate to the constitutional reform, the recent constitutional reform which has been rejected by a constitutional referendum. If we take into account the distribution of votes, from those who were favorable, those who were against, and those who decided to abstain, apart from some dissident parliamentarians, we have party choices behind the decision. So in this case it was the Democratic Party which decided to vote in favor of the reform. So that's why my main focus is to look at what parties think in order to understand how their ideology has led to a certain type of reforms in Italy. And then there is the problem of the perspective. The common perspective in this kind of studies of party politics, party competition and so on, is to look at the party's individual agenda. So we look at whether a party is leftist or rightist, whether a party is in government or in opposition, and by looking at their ideological background, we can be able to understand whether they will be in favor of decentralization or opposed to that. And we have a lot of literature on party positioning on issues. This is a literature which starts from Downs, Stokes, then we have the literature on party change with Harmel and Giarda, and also in the field of territorial politics we have a lot of papers, books that has developed this perspective. In my research, I will keep an eye also on the party's individual agenda, but I also decided to integrate the party system agenda. We have to imagine these two levels of analysis not as, how can we say, totally separated from each other. They are integrated, and the distinction is a purely theoretical one. But at the same time, I think that this theoretical distinction is really important in order to develop a full-fledged analysis of party politics on a specific policy dimension, such as the territorial one. The questions, the typical research questions that are addressed by the party system agenda are, for example, does the political system discuss about the territorial issue? Is the issue resistant over time? Is there conflict or consensus among the parties of the system on that specific issue? How does the system frame the issue? And in order to develop the system level agenda, I took the agenda setting literature which has developed for policy making and especially in the American politics, for the American politics. So it is the literature, for example, from Baumgartner. Then it has been also translated to Western parliamentary systems by, for example, Graham Pedersen. And this is a very interesting venue of research which deserves to be explored by students and by scholars of party politics. And I will show you how I try to develop this perspective. So I had the research question, I had more or less the two perspectives in mind, but then I needed the instrument to measure and to address my research question. As far as my focus is on what do parties think on decentralization and on territorial reform, I should measure parties' ideology. I could use one of the many data sets that currently exist and that measure party positioning on several issues. So, for example, we have the expert surveys developed by Marx and Hug. They are very widely used. There is the Comparative Manifesto project. Nonetheless, I decided to create a data set on my own. Why? Because I try to take the best from all the existing data sets, but I wanted to make a data set and to create a data set that was useful for my own purposes, which were purposes to, my purpose was to analyze exactly the decentralization and the party's ideology on territorial reforms in detail. So in my data set, I work on the science. First of all, I take into account the electoral manifestos of Italian political parties. So I collected 100 electoral manifestos from 1963 to 2013, so to the latest general elections. And I made a manual content analysis of each electoral manifesto. I divided the document into quasi-sentences, which is the common approach of the comparative manifesto project, and I basically counted how many sentences were dealing with the territorial reforms, and this is the salience. So the salience measures exactly how much parties talk about territorial issues. But then I wanted to be more precise, so I didn't count just how many sentences were dealing with territorial reforms, but I also added a quote to understand whether this sentence was positive, so in favor of the centralist reforms, or negative, so against the centralist reform, or there is also a third option, they are neutral. Because sometimes political talk is just empty talk, so just a rhetoric in which a party does not assume a real stance on the issue. And then I calculate the position by subtracting the centralist statements to the decentralist statements. The result sometimes might be also to have contradictory electoral manifestos, because, and it happens, as I will show in a while, very frequently in Italian electoral manifestos, there is sometimes an even number of pro-decentralist statements and anti-decentralist statements, and they annul each other, and they bring to the situation of contradictory electoral manifestos. Sometimes we have blurring electoral manifestos, so cases in which parties just mention decentralization, territorial reforms, but they actually do not take any clear stance on the issue, so they don't declare clearly whether they are in favor or not. Thirdly, I calculate also whether parties are in favor of specific aspects of decentralization. Because, especially in the Italian case, the transfer of competencies can be differentiated according to the policy area. There could be a transfer of competencies in the field of education, in the field of health, and so on. And sometimes a party might be in favor of decentralizing education and not in health. So I try to calculate also party positioning on the specific policy areas of decentralization. Last thing, and this is something that I took from the agenda setting literature, is the aspect of frames, because parties compete with each other not only by declaring whether they are in favor or not of something, but also by justifying their positioning. And this is just a frame, so sometimes a party might say that it is in favor of decentralization because it enhances the efficiency of the system. This is a frame, so whether a party uses the efficiency frame to justify its support to decentralization. This is an element that we currently do not have in the existing datasets and that I added in my dataset. This is how a worksheet appeared in my files. I basically divided the electoral manifesto into quasi-sentences, and then I added the codes for each sentences. So when I added the code like 101, it means that that sentence is a sentence that deals favorably with the decentralization. So we have a sentence in which the party declares that it is in favor of decentralization. And in this case, it is in favor of a specific policy area. I don't remember which is this code, but it is a specific policy area related to decentralization. And then I made my calculation and I created an aggregate data set with all the datasets, all the data in which my unit of observation are the parties, so the electoral manifestos. So it is basically based on the existing approach. I just added some elements. If you want to know more on this methodology, there is a recently published article by Regional and Federal Studies in which I explain my methodology. I obtained good results of validity test. As far as I'm the only coder, I'm going to double check my data because the double test and retest the reliability is one of the reliability checks that I can do to enhance the reliability of my data. But the validity test has given very good performances. I would like to provide, especially for those who are not familiar with the Italian troubled process of decentralization, what is the timeline of the event, and I try to make a timeline in just one slide. It's a very complex one, so I will make an oversimplification of the process, of course. We started from the 1948, so our constitution has entered in force on the 1st of January 1948 in a really and strongly centralized state. Italy was a unitary and centralized state. Because the constitution was the result of a compromise, essentially a compromise between the communists and the Christian Democrats. Communists were in line with the Soviet ideology against any form of decentralization. Christian Democrats were in favor of forms of decentralization. The result was to create 5 special regions. And the other regions were just written on paper, so in the constitution we had already the definition of regions, so Italy is divided into regions, but they have not been implemented in those years. And we had to wait 20 years to have the laws which really and actually implemented the ordinary regions. So, for 20 years we had just the 5 special autonomies, which are Val d'Aosta, Sicily and so on, but no, we didn't have any activity of the ordinary regions. Finally, in 1968, something changed, and it was a partisan logic again, because there was a shift towards the center-leftist ideology. There were center-leftist governments. The Communist Party shifted also to regionalism and to support regions because also they were supported by the fact that in some regions they had a stronghold of voters and of support. The only opposition was made by the Movimento Sociale Italiano, which was the heir of the fascist party. So finally in 1968 we had these laws to implement the regions and the first election of the regional councils in 1970. Then, after 7 years, we had the maximalist phase of regionalism, so many laws, further laws, which have further transferred competencies towards the subnational levels. And then we have 20 years later, so in Italy we go from 20 years to 20 years to make reforms. After 20 years, we had another step of decentralization with the Basile laws, and then there is the season, let's say, of the party reforms, the partisan reform. In 2001, the center-left passed a bill with a constitutional reform, which was the reform of the Title V. Which basically was considered a sort of federalist reform because it created a situation in which the Article 117, which is the article where the competencies are listed, now lists only the state competencies, and it leaves all the residual competencies to the regions. And then there are also areas of concurrent competence. This reform has been also approved by a constitutional referendum. And then we go to 2006, where there has been another reform, which was broader with many other elements, and this time it was approved by the center-right government, but it was rejected by another referendum. There was a law on fiscal federalism, although its concrete implementation was really troubled, also because in the meanwhile there was the technical government by Mario Monti, which has made a little bit more complex the implementation of the fiscal federalism in Italy. And at least we have, there is a mistake, it is 2016, not 19, but at least we had the latest constitutional reform, which was adopted by the Governo Renzi, but it has been rejected less than 2 weeks ago. But it basically was interpreted as a sort of a recentralization because many competencies were attributed to the state and no more to the regions. Actually, the situation was a little bit more complex because in fact, we have to say that the Constitution accepted and integrated many of the sentences of the Constitutional Court, which has pronounced, for example, for all the cases of concurrent legislation between the state and the regions. So it would have made maybe, it could have addressed the problem of the concurrent legislation between the state and the region, but actually didn't, it has been rejected, so we cannot know whether it would have been led to further centralization or not. So this is just to provide you an overview of how Italy can be defined as a decentralized system. Actually, it is a rather somewhat decentralized system. Of course, there are still some elements of centralistic control. We cannot say we are a federal system, of course. I will show in this third part of my presentation how I try to apply the agenda setting literature to my work on territorial reforms. My research is just to start from some basic common assumptions and to try to reformulate them by using Italy as a case, as a theory-modifying case study. This is something that, for example, has been developed by Rolfing. So we can use a case study just to check whether common assumptions still holds and otherwise try to reformulate them. One of the main assumptions that is commonly made for the Italian case is that the issue, in this case the territorial dimension, has been always present and resistant over time in the political agenda. So it's something like a stable presence of this dimension in the debate, without any further analysis on whether this issue has experienced different levels of salience over time. Another assumption that I call the consensus assumption is that in Italy, but in general when there are territorial reforms, there is a large agreement among parties, so territorial reforms are the result of a consensus among parties. This is something that sounds like the consensus that Inge had referred to as for the formative phase of the European integration, so the permissive consensus against the constraining dissensus that we are experiencing now in the European Union. And then there is this last assumption that I call the dwarf among giants, which is also the title of a paper, according to which, and this is an assumption that starts from Bonnie Megid research. We have in the territorial, for what concerns the territorial dimension, some niche actors, in this case the regionalist parties, which introduce their core issue in the agenda. So, according to Bonnie Megid, the issues are new issues are introduced into the agenda because there are these niche actors which bring them into the debate. And then they compel, they constrain the other parties to take a stance, because once they introduce this issue, other parties are compelled to take a stance, so whether to dismiss it whether to accommodate, so they decide to support regionalist reforms, decentralist reforms, just to accommodate the demands of the regionalist actors, or to oppose them, and this is the adversarial strategy. So I will try to look one by one at each assumption by using Italy, as I told you before, as a theory-modified case study. So I will test the hypothesis based on the assumptions, point out the limits of the main assumptions, and try to reformulate them. First, we start with the politicization assumption. As I told you before, it argues that this issue has been always present and resistant in the Italian political agenda. As we can see from this chart, we can realize that actually in Italy, yes, it has been present at least since 1963. And if we take into account the average salience of an issue according to Sonia Alonso, an average salience of an issue of the 2%, considering that we have several issues in one electoral manifesto, should be considered as a relevant issue for political parties. But what we can observe is that we have to look at the black line, because in the black line we don't have the Lega Nord, which of course will bring the line to much higher. But we have ebbs and flows in salience. This chart is the same as before, but it just shows the incremental change. What we can observe is that attention decreases after a major reform occurred. If you remember the timeline that I showed you before, we had the momentum here in 1968, in 1972, in the late 90s, and in 2006-2009. We have a peak in salience before a major reforms occur, and then salience decrease in the following election. What is the suggestion? What does this picture suggest? First of all, in Italy, the territorial dimension has been always present in the electoral manifesto. I just found 8 manifestos out of 100 in which there was no mention of territorial issues. So it is a relevant issue for all parties. However, although it managed to resist over time, its politicization has experienced ebbs and flows, and it always happens in issues. Carmines and Stimson suggests that it is very difficult to understand the reasons why an issue enters into the agenda, because there is a complex interconnection of environmental dynamics. We have to take into account the political setting, public opinion, the economic context, and so on. But it is more important to focus on the following evolution of the issues. So the real question that we need to address is to try to understand why we have these ebbs and flows in our picture. So we can reformulate the assumption by formulating a new assumption and a new hypothesis in which the salience of the territorial dimension should be conceived no more as a dependent variable, but as an independent variable, which predicts, in a sense, a period of major reform. So whenever we have an heightened and higher attention on these issues, maybe we should expect a major reform in the next legislature. Then we have the consensus assumption. Here we have the assumption according to which any reform has been the result of a broad consensus among the main parties. Here I show you the directional certainty, so the position of parties. When we have parties with a positive sign on this scale, which goes from -1 to 1, it means that the party is in favor of decentralization. And as we can see, the highest bar is in the positive values. So this chart suggests that most of the parties maybe are in favor of decentralization. So there was a broad consensus among Italian parties, and they were all happy about decentralization. Here the picture appears a little bit more nuanced, because yes, we have many parties with very high values on this direction uncertainty, but then we have many parties which show blurring or contradictory stance. They are parties whose score on this direction uncertainty is very close to zero. And as I told you before, this closeness to zero might be due to different things. For example, it might be due to the fact that many of these sentences dealing with decentralization are sentences which are formulated in a very neutral form. Or but we have just a few cases. Here I show you a table in which I counted all the electoral manifestos in which at least the 60% of the statements are just neutral. But we have a very few cases in which we have just a neutral statement and just one cases in which we have only neutral statements. Most of the cases are made up of parties in which we have an even number, almost even number, of pro-decentralist and anti-decentralist statements, which annul each other. Then I wanted to go further in my first finding, and I wanted to see in all the electoral manifestos a party positioning on each specific policy area which should be addressed by decentralization. So this is, for example, party positioning on decentralization in education, in the education field. In Italy, we don't have too much decentralized education system, but in the last 20 years it has been decentralized a lot. As we can see, this is what we call in Italy the First Republic, so the period in which we had a proportional system and so on, which ends in 1992. In the so-called First Republic, we had most of the parties, of the few parties who deal with decentralization in education, who had essentially positive attitude. If we move to the Second Republic, we have an increasing number of attention of this aspect of decentralization in education, because it started to become more salient in our debate. But also we have some parties which show a certain opposition to the idea of decentralizing education. And here I translated for you some example. In 1983, the Communist Party said that we need a unitary schooling system, so to guarantee the entire national territory, the pursuit of appropriate formative results. And in fact, the Communist Party was the only one which in the First Republic was against the decentralization in the education field. If we move in the Second Republic, the Lega Nord and Polo said that devolution to we should make the devolution to regions of the responsibilities for school, and it was a strongly pro-decentralist statement in favor of decentralization in education. The Ulivo in 2001, on the contrary, argued that it would be dangerous to entirely devolve teaching activities to the region. So we can see that there is no consensus on this. This is what happens in the field of health. Again, in the First Republic there is some debate, although not so much sharp. When we move to the Second Republic, we see a little bit of more dissensus, but still in the field of education there is no complete agreement on whether it should be decentralized or not. And these are again other examples. In 1963, the Christian Democrats, who were against decentralization in the field of health, said that we should take into account the specific needs of the regions by guaranteeing them adequate state financing in an effort of equal distribution. On the contrary, the Socialist Party in 1963 said that we had to create a national sanitary system widely decentralized on local basis. Actually, in Italy we have a highly centralized health system, and the Movimento 5 Stelle in 2013 said, on the contrary, that devolution is undermining the universality and homogeneity of the national sanitary system. This is another case of law and order. This is a very peculiar case because in the First Republic, no one dared to talk about devolving and transferring competencies to regions in the field of law and order. But what happens after the Lega Nord appears into the scene? The Lega Nord is the first party that in Italy started to talk about devolving competencies in this field also to the regions. And then all the other parties had to react to this proposal by, of course, preventing any attack from the idea that the state should have the monopoly of the use of force. In fact, this is an example of contrasting position. The Lega Nord Polo in 2001 said that we should make the devolution to regions of the responsibility for the protection of citizens from urban crime. Actually, in Italy, it sounds very strange, a statement like this. But Alleanza Nazionale in 1996 replied that we can and should discuss about decentralization, but the state cannot renounce to defense and fight against crime. So just to make sure that this is a state competence. So we observed that many countries display a neutral stance on decentralization because they have contradictory positions on different aspects of the transfer of competencies. We have observed that by looking at specific policy areas, there appears patterns of disagreement among parties. So we can reformulate the consensus assumption by assuming that the apparent consensus on the territorial reforms actually hides disagreement and dissensus among parties on single specific policy areas to which competencies should be redistributed. And finally, I go to the dwarf among giants assumption. Maybe it is the part that I developed that I mostly developed so far, because this is the assumption which, according to Boni-Medit, states that a new issue, a secondary dimension like the territorial dimension, is introduced by a niche actor, in this case the regionalist party. So we should argue that the Lega Nord, which is the first main regionalist actor which has been competitive at national level in Italy, it should have introduced this issue in the agenda. But actually we can see that the issue was present well before the appearance of the Lega Nord, and of course we cannot argue that smaller regionalist parties had the effect to introduce the issue in the agenda. However, we observe that after a period of stalemate in the attention, which is in the 80s, we have a steady increase of attention and of salience of decentralization in the 90s. So what we can say is that the electoral rise of the Lega Nord did not affect party positioning on the territorial dimension. At the same time, it did not force the other party to assume a stance, because neglecting accommodative, adversarial and neutral position were present also before the appearance of the Lega Nord. So what we can say? We can say that the appearance of a niche party in the party system did not introduce the issue in the agenda, but it certainly contributed to revitalize the attention on the issue. Of course, this downsizes Medit's argument a lot, because according to this reformulation, it seems that a niche party like the Lega Nord has had little impact on party strategies. However, we should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can still retrieve Medit's assumption, of course, by reformulating it according to the framing literature. As I told you before, parties have three tools to compete on issues. The third tool is the tool of the frame. So, how do parties frame and justify their position? The idea is that the emergence of niche actors is usually accompanied by the introduction of new arguments, which have also the effects to revitalize such issue. This is an argument by Baumgartner. So, according to my reformulation, the emergence of a new actor into the political agenda using new frames had the effect not only to increase the salience on the issue, but also to, in a sense, introduce new arguments that have revitalized the debate. So I bring you some example again. This is the territorial solidarity frame. When a party show a score of close to 1, it means that it is in favor of a form of selfishness of the local autonomies. If it displays a negative score, it means that the party says that yes, we should decentralize, but we need to keep and to preserve the territorial cohesion. As we can see, this frame was seldom present in the electoral manifestos before the Lega Nord. After the Lega Nord, there is a huge increase of the use of this frame, and especially we have only the Lega Nord, which says that we should decentralize because the North should keep away from the wasteful South. And all the other parties follow the Lega Nord by arguing that all the decentralist reforms should be adopted, but by keeping in mind that the territorial cohesion should be preserved. For example, the Lega Nord in 1996 says that the people of the North would be able to reduce the public debt to sustainable limits by itself, but it obviously cannot carry the burden of all the debts created by the South and so on. De Olivo in 2001 said that it is still necessary to ensure forms and instruments of state and or interregional solidarity, although it was in favor of decentralization. This is the frame of deficiency, so whether decentralization should be supported because it increases the efficiency of the state or conversely it hinders the efficiency of the state. This was used also in the First Republic, but after 1992, in light of the harsh rhetoric of the Lega Nord against the robber Rome, against the corruption scandals and so on, all the parties used this efficiency frame to try to justify the idea of decentralization and to say that yes, we need to decentralize because Rome has been wasteful and we need to decentralize just to contain and to refrain the wastes from Rome. So, for example, this is the argument used by the Liberal Party in 1979, in which it was against decentralization because it would have increased the cost and of bureaucracy. On the contrary, the PDL in 1996 said that within the framework of the broader state reform there is the need to revise and strengthen the system of autonomies because it would have enhanced efficiency. The last frame is that one of national unity. So whether decentralization should be adopted even at the cost of dividing Europe, or whether national unity should be preserved even in the case of decentralization. As you can see, in the First Republic, all the parties that used this argument were parties which were in favor of, sometimes in favor of decentralization, in some cases also against the decentralization, but we don't have cases in which national unity was threatened in a sense. After the Lega Nord entered into the scene, of course, we have an increase in the number of parties which have used this national unity frame. Because the Lega Nord broke the taboo of the national unity. For the first time in Italy, we had talks about secession and division of Italy, and all the other parties had to reassure their voters that their project of decentralization would have not implied Lega secession. These are other examples, but I will skip on them just for reason of time. I want just to show you my concluding remarks. The study of party attitudes on issues, territorial but not only, first of all should integrate the agenda system level. And second, all the commonly shared assumptions on party competition on issues should be reformulated in light of the descriptive findings that are provided by the Italian case if we consider it as a theory-modifying case study. In particular, the patterns of salience seem to explain the path of reform, so we should conceive of politicization as an independent variable to explain the process of policy reforms. Second, the pattern of conflict over an issue should take into consideration the possible disagreement over specific subdimensions. Thirdly, niche actors do not introduce issues or determine the pattern of conflict, but rather they might contribute to revitalize the attention or to reframe the debate over a policy dimension. So my next steps will be those of reorganizing my theoretical model, double check the data as I told you before for the test, retest reliability, to refine my conclusion, and to add a further chapter on the congruence between what a party promised and what a party at least vote on concrete policy reforms when they are finally in the parliament. And the next steps beyond the personal research will be to connect my research on territorial reforms to this project that has been currently that has won Horizon 2020, which is led by the University of Basile, and in which Siena will be active with as a partner in a work package on frame analysis of autonomous parties' political discourse, and we will be leading a work package on experimental surveys to analyze people's perception of territorial inequalities and spatial justice. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda, for your very rich and interesting presentation. I give the word to our discussant, Sean Müller from University of Bern. So you have 10-15 minutes for your remarks.
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation and for organizing to the center, the university, the usual crowd that is here to be talking about territorial politics. And thanks to you for a very, as Andreas said, very rich and detailed account of 60 years of reforms, I put them in quotation marks, and the issue of territorial politics in that. So I mainly have some comments about the book proposal that you sent me, but I'll try to factor in some of the stuff that I thought while you were presenting, because I think some of the comments I have relate to both, and some are really more detailed about the proposal that maybe I can also tell you later, because it doesn't make sense that we go through all the details. Obviously, the strength of your project, of the book or of the thesis, as you have defended it already, is that you have your own data. So I would be hesitant to downgrade it to a tool, because a tool, I mean, I have a pen and that's my tool to write. So really you have done much more than just to have a tool, but you have your own original data set that is not only your own, but also goes beyond what is out there already, not only in the press, so in the scope and the number of manifestos that you've covered for one country, but also in including these neutral, as I understood from the other two, they don't have it. And it's important for you, as you show in the proposal and also in the presentation, that through that you can not just talk about the saliency, but you can also add a third strategical element. Now that's a tool, which is the blurring or the contradiction, right? So by factoring that in, you can contribute an additional element of really party strategy. So that's what I found to be a really strength. So both in a way are connected. So you have your own data, and the way you conceive of the data, you can do much more than just talk about salience and positioning, but you can also talk about the framing. Because I think the framing is important, and the examples that you brought both in the presentation and in the paper about particularly territorial solidarity, but also policy-specific debates that might be hidden if we look at the aggregate, but that emerge once we open up not only the country, but also the parties and the different issues, and we put them in relation to each other. And the contrast between the First and the Second Republic are very revealing in that sense, that all of a sudden there is a debate, there is a disagreement, it goes in all sorts of directions. That's what makes it interesting. However, right? So with all this richness and all these detailed account of the different parties, I had the feeling that I was a bit lost in too much detail. So I would advise you to try to get the main story sharper and quicker and shorter. So you have a lot of empirical data that speak to a lot of different theories. So you have the agenda at the party system level, and you have the individual party. Now I know you try to connect it. It wasn't really clear to me why you absolutely want to connect those two things. I mean, sometimes there is a reason that two things are kept separate, because they are separate. So if you want to connect the two levels, then I think you need And obviously, I haven't read your whole book or thesis, just some synopsis and writing material. So from what I could understand, it hasn't been developed well enough for me to really be convinced that, okay, you've done it because, you fulfill a purpose. So I think you need to think more about connecting or just dropping one of the two and really just speak of one theoretical level. And then the second major advice I would have is, what does it speak to? So you said at the beginning that it's a theory modifying case study. Fine. But in what sense? So you have these assumptions, and some of them seem to be particular to Italy. So people say something about Italy, and you come along and you say, well, actually it's not really the case, or it's more complex than that. But I think you can do more than that. So from what I understood that you have done in the articles is to do exactly that. And it should also be part of the book that you say, well, this is an Italian case. A bit in the Putnam tradition, right? So I'm using the case of Italy, not to understand Italy better, but to really speak about the dynamics of territorial reform and positioning and repositioning and debates between the parties, and then how this affects the territorial reform. So what is the consequence of that? So by all means, I would do what you propose to do in chapter 5, from promises to facts. Because I think it's crucial that you make that link to really contribute to a better understanding not only of Italy, but also of how, because it will also help you to argue why do we need to know all the details about the manifestos, not just the positive, negative, neutral. We need to know because these translate into our measurement of framing, and the framing matters for the actual reforms that then result out of the interplay of the parties in the government. But other than that, I think you have a great project, and well done, first of all, and good luck with refining it and getting the book out. And oh yeah, one other thing, you should definitely cite this recent book that Mazzoleni and I edited, because we take up some of the issues with the policy specificness, but obviously not in a quantitative electoral manifesto measurement way, but some of the theoretical conceptual thoughts might be useful for you.
Thanks, Sean. So there are some relevant, interesting remarks. If you want to try to answer to Sean.
Yes, of course I reply on the drawbacks because I'm very well aware of them. This is why I took this chance to talk here with you, just to take some feedbacks on what I think are the points of drawbacks that affect my current research. So far it is too long and too dispersive in a sense, because I wanted to look at different perspectives. So I know I need to find a single fil rouge to connect all the pieces of my story. And actually the individual level is that one that makes me feel more uncomfortable. In a sense, I started from the individual level's perspective, and this was the first part that I developed and that I wrote. And then I decided and I understood that it was not enough for me, and I went to the agenda setting. So my attempt will be to try to connect the two, but of course if I had to choose between the two and whether to give attention to just one of them, I will keep the agenda setting, because I think that it is the only perspective that so far is missing in current literature on party politics and territorial party politics. As for to whom my research is going to speak, this is the problem that I had when I tried to make and create my book proposal, for example. So a case study is always a problem, especially a case study when you are not a case study like the USA. The USA is a case study that is commonly published. In Italy it is a little bit different. My attempt, for example, in my paper that I published on party politics was to, for example, start from, in this case, one assumption, which is maybe its assumption, and by studying the Italian case to try to show that at at least in the Italian case for the territorial reforms, for what concerns the Lega Nord, this assumption should be refined. So I invite other scholars to develop and to use the same hypothesis also to the other cases. But that's why I added also this fifth chapter, because otherwise my theory modifying case study would have remained a little bit poor in terms of explanatory power. So I decided to add this chapter, which still is in progress, so I don't have findings yet because it was not part of my dissertation, but it was a part that I decided it was necessary to improve my research. Otherwise, a case study would have been meaningless or with very little interest for a broader target, not only limited to the Italian target, to the Italian audience.
Thank you. So I can open, or if you want to reply, it's okay. And I open discussion with the room. Oscar?
Yes, I have some questions about your presentation. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting for me. Also because I didn't read your papers and PhD, so I have a question about what modifying theory is. I'm not sure about that definition about that. Could you tell us a little bit more about what modifying theory is? And this is a general, specific or general question, but the other are more about the selection of parties. Do you select only national parties and represented party representing national parliament? Because it's not the same, especially in Aosta or in other regions, we have no national parties but represented national level. So that's for me unclear. And other point is you mentioned that this contradiction within the manifesto about specific issues, but is this neutral? I don't know. I don't understand really if you use the term neutral instead contradictory. I don't understand really this. Sorry, because I understand this. How you use the term neutral, and how is dealing with the contradiction within this manifestos. And also the question of the territorial solidarity is connected both on cultural, economic, other dimensions. How do you frame that, or how is framed by parties this dimension of the territorial, the solidarity? And of course, my question is also connected with this possibility to apply this model or this approach to other countries, because it's very interesting. And I'm also a little bit skeptic about this possibility to combine different policy analysis, behavior of parties within the parliaments. That becomes a little bit ambition. Maybe it would be interesting to develop more the comparison using this approach on frame, on issue analysis and so on. That I think would be very interesting to develop more about in terms of comparison. And the last question is about the ideology. Is it also, do you connect this the importance, the salience of territorial issues with the party families or not? Is this connected or not? Is this there are some connection or interesting linking? Because socialist parties, Christian Democrats maybe are different way to which they frame the territorial issues. And do you know a little bit more? Can you tell me or us a little bit more about that? Thank you.
Okay, the concept of theory modifying case studies took from Rethinking. It is a very recent book. These are the case studies because, of course, I don't develop a comparative analysis because with my kind of data set it would be practically impossible. You need a deep knowledge of the language to carefully analyze each specific statements and so on. But in this sense, we can use a case study to describe and to try to test hypotheses based on existing theories. And once we find that these hypotheses are not completely rejected, but according to my findings, they might be reformulated. So I try to reformulate my hypotheses, which are grounded on theory, according to my findings, and they are offered to further research, let's say, and they will provide elements for further research on which to further test my hypothesis. So this is just a kind of case study, but it is just on the same tradition of Lippert definition of case studies, let's say. As for the selection of parties, I considered all the parties, all the electoral manifestos of the parties which entered in the parliament.
National
Parliament, yes. When in Italy we have just the national parliament. I know that it is strange, but no, we have the parliament in Sicily also.
Maybe you have also European Parliament. Sorry.
So this is a point. Yes, this is the case study of Italy, but yes, I agree. But yes, I consider the national parliament. In some cases, I had difficulties, and it is practically impossible to find some electoral manifesto of very small party that, especially in the First Republic, were able to enter the parliament because of the lack of any threshold. But apart from these cases, I tried to collect all the parties that competed and has been elected in parliament. Okay, the concept of contradiction, I understand it's very complex if you don't read exactly the methodology. It's a very complex methodology. First of all, there is the directional certainty. So I called it the parties, party position and parties, by counting how many statements are in favor of decentralization, how many are against, and then I made just a subtraction. But I also counted the neutral statement. So the statements that are coded like 100, so the 100, in which the statement doesn't say anything clear. So we can have two situations. The first situation is a situation in which a party has most of its statements which are coded as 100, so it doesn't say anything clear. And this is a completely blurring electoral manifesto. It is just empty talk. The party talks a lot but doesn't say anything on decentralization in concrete. It happens, but it happens not very frequently, we should say. The second case is the case of contradictory stances. We have an almost even number of pro-decentralist statements and anti-decentralist statements. Of course, if we subtract them, the final score is close to 0. So we have the same situation, score close to 0, as in the neutral statement, as in the case of blurring, because they are not counted in the calculation of the directional certainty. But it is due to a very different scenario. The party talks and the party takes sharp and clear stances, let's say on education or on health, but at least what we see in the final aggregate score is a 0. But this 0 hides a very complex positioning on the issue with very differentiated patterns of. This is something that, for example, in the comparative manifesto project is completely lost because we don't have this differentiation of different elements, because we don't have the neutral code. The territorial solidarity, it is measured just in economic terms. There is a table in my appendix, for example, or in the paper of Regional Federal Study, in which I clearly clarify what I mean for this territorial solidarity frame. So, for example, whenever a party says that, okay, but we should decentralize, but we should make sure that the state makes all the regions in a certain sense equal to each other. So we have poorer regions in Italy, so the North should help the poorer regions with its contribution and so on. On the contrary, and this is the frame used by the Lega Nord, the North should keep its resources because it is productive, and the South is wasteful and should not receive anything. This is more or less, and in a very oversimplified way, the territorial solidarity frame. The application to other countries, of course, would be auspicable, but as I told you before, I have the problem, of course, of analyzing in great detail each electoral manifesto. So it is something that I hope can be done with a further comparative effort. But the idea of a theory modifying case study is just to provide some food for thought for other scholars, for example. Maybe it is too ambitious, but I try to do that. Ideology is something that I tested, but at the individual party level. So at the individual party level, I make the classic analysis in which I say whether the left-right orientation or the distinction in party family, I controlled for all the possible variables, but it is a classic analysis on party positioning, as we can see in several analyses, and I got very common results. So the idea that in some periods the leftists have been more in favor of, the socialists and the communists have been more in favor of decentralization than the rightists or the nationalists and so on. But still at the individual level we lose a lot of information, that is this differentiation among different aspects of decentralization. Because if we talk about decentralization in Italy, it doesn't make a sense. We don't have decentralization, but we have decentralization in the field of health, in the field of education. It is a very complex system, so I think we should reach this level of detail to better understand ideology in this specific policy dimension.
So, I don't know if any question to Linda? Simon Stuckelberg.
Yeah, thanks very much for this presentation. It's very interesting. Perhaps first question on your regarding your first assumption or first point about the relationship between saliency and the reform. So how do you? I'm not sure if I really get the way that the salience is an independent variable for the reform, and to what extent it's not the other way around, that you have a tension because you want to have a reform. Just this relationship. The second question would be about how do you didn't present on that, but just out of interest, like how you see the relationship between salience and positions. So are the most extreme parties the ones which also dedicate the most space to an issue? So what is kind of the relationship you see? And third, I think it's really interesting your application or reformation of the Megid theory of putting it or looking at the frames. My question there would be perhaps, are there certain frames which disappeared? Because you looked at, basically said, with Lega Nord there some frames got more attention, but are there others which disappeared, or how did we talk, or did the parties talk about it before the Lega Nord? And perhaps just restate, so did the salience increase with the Lega Nord, or not at all, or?
Yes, the point that you raised on how I put salience as an independent variable when reformulating the politicization assumption, I think this is still one of the weakest points of my theoretical formulation. I still have to work more on that. But it just, this idea and this reformulation starts from a remark that I got in a very recent presentation of my research, in which it has been argued that actually from what I present, it clearly appears that salience and politicization might be considered as an instrument to understand and to predict when the reforms will be done and will be created. But I agree with you that this point should be further clarified, at least on a theoretical point. I did in my dissertation this analysis between salience and position. I don't remember exactly because this is a point that now I completely didn't take into consideration in the last 2 years, to be honest, because I focused more on the agenda setting. But as far as I remember, there is a direct relationship, as it always happens in this kind of studies, between science and position. So the more you talk, but this is not always true, because sometimes we had in the First Republic the case of the Movimento Sociale Italiano, which had a lot of talk about decentralization, but in very critical terms, because it was completely and fiercely against this process of decentralization, because it was a nationalist party at all. And I think it was the only real nationalist party. Now the Lega Nord is the real nationalist part of Italy. It is strange, but something that happens in our country. The reformulation of Megid, you are perfectly right in pointing me out that I should better clarify that what I mean is that frames do not appear after the Lega Nord, but are used in a different way and are used in a more frequent way. As I showed you, efficiency frame, territorial solidarity frame, national unity frame were already present before 1992, but they were used in a completely different way, and secondly, they were seldomly used. After the appearance of the Lega Nord, there is a sort of increase in the use of these frames, because now the parties need to justify what they were doing. So what changes the how, not just the appearance, because these frames already existed, of course. So the Lega Nord changes the way of talking and the way also of using the same frames. And as I told, and this is just to answer to your last question, revitalization of the talk, so salience increased, or again increased again after a period of stalemate after the Lega Nord appearance, because of course it boosted the debate. So Megid's assumption holds true, but they hold true if we take into account the period after 1992, because before 1992 there has been also a high salience and high politicization of the issue, but it was in the 60s, in the 70s, and it was due to different reasons than the role of a regionalist and niche actor.
Thank you. I don't know if there are other questions. If it's not the case, I want to thank you once more again, Linda Basile and also Sean Müller for the discussion. And on peut clore la session ici et juste rappeler qu'il y aura un nouveau cycle de conférences OVPR, donc au printemps 2017, et un calendrier donc, de ce cycle de conférences suivra bientôt. Merci encore à toutes et à tous de votre présence et merci à Linda et à Sean.